All right, the last story. The ACLU is an important organization for me. It is something that really did play a significant part in forming my childhood politics, my political perspective. I remember it very well when I was a kid reading about the decision of mostly leftist and Jewish ACLU lawyers to defend the right of the American Nazi Party to march through Skokie, Illinois, a town filled with Holocaust survivors in 1977, purely on principle, on the ground that the First Amendment has to protect the most hated people among us in order for it to be protected by anyone. That ACLU is long ago dead. The idea that it's a civil liberty organization now that's devoted to defending people's rights independent of their ideology. They still do occasionally some of that work. They are, in fact, right now defending the NRA against claims that New York State under Governor Cuomo persecuted the NRA for their political views. So it's not like there aren't any lawyers left in the ACLU still do some of that work. But by and large, overall, the ACLU is basically just like any other left liberal social justice organization. And as such, it has become paralyzed by a sort of caricature of a ridiculous left-wing, self-indulgent, comical culture that constantly finds racism under every rock and bigotry under every rock. And as a result, they're constantly managing fights among one another where they're always accusing one another of being racist and sexist and transphobic and homophobic. And these organizations can't get anything done because the kinds of people they're attracting are the ones who spend most of their time attacking anyone near them. And anyone who's worked inside a left liberal media outlet like The Intercept or an activist group or a governmental organization will tell you that they're often crippled with this kind of a mindset. And so the ACLU was the target, this Times article about a particular lawsuit that I find extremely amusing just in terms of how extreme it is. But on the one hand, it is extreme, but on the other, it's very common in terms of what these left liberal outlets that are drowning in these culture wars that they themselves have bred are now facing. So let's just take a look at the New York Times report. It actually just kind of lets the report, the event speak for itself, but clearly the idiocy of it jumps off the page. So the headline is, the ACLU said a worker used racist tropes and then fired her, but did she? The Civil Liberties Group is defending itself in an unusual case that weighs what kind of language may be evidence of bias against Black people. Now, basically, what's happening here is the ACLU has an employee they fired because they claim she made racist statements against her Black managers. She herself is an Asian woman who has spent years claiming she's the victim inside the ACLU of sexism and other forms of abuse. But because her supervisors, the ones about whom she was complaining, are Black, and they went to the ACLU and said she's a racist while she was saying they're sexist, the ACLU had to side with the Black managers and say that she was guilty of hate speech and racism and therefore fired her. And now she's suing them. And in order to defend itself, the ACLU has to argue for a very broad definition of what hate speech means. The exact opposite of what the ACLU is supposed to do, which is argue for a very limited view of what hate speech is and a very broad view of free speech. But this is the kind of idiocy and just the kind of self-negation that these organizations get led into because of left liberal culture. So let's take a look at this. Quote, Kate O was no one's idea of a get-along to go-along employee. She considered herself a whistleblower and an advocate for other women in the office, drawing unflattering attention to an environment she said was rife with sexism, burdened with unmanageable workloads, and stymied by a fear-based culture. So she envisioned herself a whistleblower inside the ACLU, calling out misogyny inside the ACLU, calling out toxic working conditions inside the ACLU. And the tables turned, and Ms. O was the one slapped with an accusation of serious misconduct. The ACLU said her complaints about several superiors, all of whom were Black, quote, used racist stereotypes. As a result, she was fired in May 2022. A trial in a case wrapped up this week in Washington, and a judge is expected to decide in the next few months whether the ACLU is justified in terminating her. The heart of the ACLU defense, arguing for an expansive definition of what constitutes racist or racially coded speech, has struck some labor and free speech lawyers as peculiar, since the organization has traditionally protected the right to free expression, operating on the principle that it may not like what someone says, but will fight to the right to say it. A lawyer representing the ACLU, Ken Margolis, said during a legal proceeding last year that it was irrelevant whether Ms. O bore no racist ill will. All that mattered, he said, was that her Black colleagues were offended and injured. Quote, "We're not here to prove anything other than the impact of her actions were very real, that she caused harm," Mr. Margolis said, according to a transcript of her remark. She caused serious harm to Black members of the ACLU community. So you have this Asian employee who ran around for years accusing everybody of being a sexist, misogynist, abusive. And of course, she was accommodated, treated like a hero, until the targets of her complaints started to be her Black supervisors. And then her Black supervisors ran to the ACLU and said, "I think her complaints against us are racist." And the ACLU said, "Well, what has she said that's racist?" And the ACLU admits nothing she said was racist. Doesn't matter, said the ACLU. In order to be a racist, in order to be able to be fired for racism, you don't have to say anything that's racist. All that matters is that what you say makes Black people uncomfortable or offends them. That's the standard of speech the ACLU is arguing for in order to defend itself from this lawsuit. Here, the New York Times goes on, quote, "Did her language add up to racism? Or was she just speaking harshly about bosses who happen to be Black? The question is the subject of an unusual unfair labor practice case brought against the ACLU by the National Labor Relations Board, which has accused the organization of retaliating against Ms. O." So the NLRB, the pro-worker union agency, is now bringing an action against the ACLU, claiming it treated its Asian worker unfairly by unjustly accusing her of racism. Quote, "A trial in this case wrapped up this week in Washington. If the ACLU loses, it could be ordered to reinstate her or pay restitution. The heart of the ACLU defense, arguing for an expansive definition of what constitutes racist or racially coded speech, has struck some labor and free speech lawyers as peculiar." We went over that. That essentially what the ACLU is doing is saying, oh, free speech is way narrower than you previously understood. Hate speech is way broader. Hate speech means not just that you've said something that's actually racist, that we can prove harbors animosity toward a member of a marginalized group, such as an African-American employee, but if you say anything that even offends them or makes them uncomfortable, you are already out of the bounds of free speech and now into hate speech. Imagine going back 30 years or 40 years and telling ACLU lawyers that in 40 years, ACLU lawyers are going to be in court desperately trying to limit the range of free speech and expand the concept of illegal hate speech for which you can be fired. And that their definition would be, you become a racist, somebody who needs to be fired, not because you've said anything racist, but simply because you've made Black people uncomfortable. And the fact that it's an Asian employee who herself has obviously spent years focused almost entirely on accusing her colleagues of misogyny and racism and every other thing she can think of, who's now victimized by that, is just so illustrative of the fact that all of this is just all-consuming. It's unsustainable, this kind of left-wing culture. And there have been reports, including by my former colleague Ryan Grimm at The Intercept, on how a huge number, in fact, you could say most left-wing activist groups and advocacy groups and media organizations are completely crippled and paralyzed by exactly this kind of internal fighting. Here from 2022, meltdowns have brought progressive advocacy groups to a standstill at a critical moment in world history. And if you read that article, he goes on to document many, many cases where even people inside these organizations who are left-wing culture warriors will say that this is so out of control in every one of our own groups that basically we're incapable of operating. So they unleash us on the world. They loved when they were deploying all these people to run around screaming racist at everybody, and now they themselves are suffering from it themselves. And I guess before you laugh too hard at the fact that the left is drowning in that, you can also look to the Daily Wire and see the fact that Candace Owens is no longer employed there because her views on Israel were a bridge too far for this valiant free speech organization to see that by no means is this mindset confined to the left, even though the left tends to be more honest about the fact that they believe in this. And I think all of this, you can put this all together and kind of see why it is so important that if you are a news organization, if you are an advocacy group, especially one claiming that you believe in free speech, as the ACLU does, the Daily Wire does, that it's very easy to uphold that when it's the views that you're most comfortable with hearing. But when it's the views that make you most uncomfortable, that is the time when you need to embrace those free speech values the most, because if you don't, it proves that you are a fraud. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.